Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Harry Truman, and the focus is standing up for what's right, civil rights in Israel. The year is 1947. Now, Harry Truman, an unlikely person to really be a champion of civil rights. As we talked about in a previous episode, he had been raised in a Confederate-leaning household. His correspondence is actually full of some racial biases and racially tinged language. But Truman had started out on this path back in his Senate re-election campaign in 1940, when he sort of put civil rights on the table, being consistent with his view of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Well, he brought that back as President of the United States when he became the first president to address the NAACP, the civil rights group, June of 1947. 10,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial. Truman was there to talk about the rights for all Americans. And he said, when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. Many of our people still suffer the indignity of insult, the narrowing fear of intimidation, and I regret to say the threat of physical and mob violence. Prejudice and intolerance in which these evils are rooted still exist. The conscience of our nation and the legal machinery which enforces it have not yet secured to each citizen full freedom of fear. We cannot wait another decade or another generation to remedy these evils. We must work as never before to cure them now. And for Harry Truman, this wasn't just talk. He set up a committee, the President's Committee on Civil Rights. He charged them to investigate the situation and come back with a report and recommendations, which they did in February of 1948. They called it To Secure These Rights, a very bold 178-page report full of recommendations. Now, this is an election year, 1948. This is very controversial, particularly in Truman's party, Democrats in the South, who were likely to oppose all of this, which they did. But they came back with recommendations, and Truman supported them all, including structural changes, the establishment of a Civil Rights Commission, a joint congressional committee on civil rights he advocated for, a civil rights division in the Justice Department, to make the Fair Employment Practices Committee permanent, to pass an anti-lynching law at the federal level, to end poll taxes, end segregationist policies in interstate transportation and housing, the military, and in other industries. It was the boldest civil rights plan since Reconstruction. He urged Congress to adopt it. I'm not asking for social equality, he said to Congress, because no such things exist. But I am asking for equality of opportunity for all human beings. And as long as I stay here, I'm going to continue that fight. When the mob gangs can take 4 people out and shoot them in the back, and everybody in the surrounding country is acquainted with who did the shooting and nothing is done about it, that country is in a pretty bad fix. From the law enforcement standpoint, follow these recommendations, we can change that policy, we can change those outcomes. Well, he fought pretty vigorously for it, but he was opposed even more vigorously in many of these areas, particularly by the representatives in the South. He did get a few things through Congress, but he also got some stuff done through executive order, including maybe the landmark decision of this era to desegregate the United States military in the summer of 1948. It had been 172 years since the United States was born with the passage of the Declaration of Independence. For the first time, blacks and whites would be side by side in the military to train and to fight. Many resisted this, including in the military, all the way up the chain of command, but frankly, orders were orders. They would follow the commander-in-chief. The United States military was desegregated thanks to Harry Truman. Now, there were some significant breakthroughs, but again, many efforts were thwarted in Congress, but still, this was the first president in decades to truly champion this cause, and he set the motion in place for future presidents to follow. Now, the other hot-button issue here for Truman to take a stand on in the area of sort of race and religion was the future of Palestine. As a senator, Harry Truman had actually talked about the plight of the Jews back in 1943 in the midst of World War II, in the middle of the Holocaust, when he was still a United States senator. He said in Chicago of that year, "No one can any longer doubt the horrible intentions of the Nazi beasts. We know that they are planning the systematic slaughter throughout all of Europe, not only of the Jews, but of vast numbers of other innocent peoples. We must draw deeply on our traditions of aid to the oppressed and on our great national generosity. This is not a Jewish problem. It is an American problem, and we must and we will face it squarely and honorably." Now, in 1943, this wasn't all that popular, but Truman stood behind it. He thought it was the right thing to do. Now, things were changing. The British were about to end their mandate, which had been in charge of sort of Palestine since World War I. Again, backing away from some of their international commitments. They announced in November of 1947, they're out, they're going to hand it over to the new United Nations. What would this mean for the Jews and the Arabs who were sort of coexisting under the British mandate in Palestine? Well, the UN only had about 6 months to figure this out. Now, the Jews basically supported a plan for partition, the original two-state solution, where each, the Jews and the Arabs, would have portions of Palestine to call their own. The Arabs completely were opposed to this. They threatened war if the Jews got any state of their own. Harry Truman was sympathetic to the plight of the Jews. He said, look, everyone else who's been dragged from his country has some place to go back to, but the Jews have no place to go. And now polls in the United States were actually in favor of this partition plan, recognizing a state of Israel to have their own home for the Jews and for the Arabs, but also many objections, including within the Truman administration. The Department of State, the Department of Defense, they were against partition because they thought it meant war, and war would mean problems in the Middle East, including the disruption of Middle East oil, could put the national security of the United States at risk. A lot of tensions on this issue. Now, Truman got a lot of strong push from a couple of his senior aides. Clifford, who had been his former military aide, was now the counsel to the president, was very strongly in favor of the partition plan. Also with David Niles, who was a leftover from the Roosevelt administration, and now is special assistant for minority affairs for Truman. They were both positioning for Truman to really support partition as the right thing to do going forward. The key question was, if the Jews declared independence when the British left, would the United States recognize the Jewish state? Now, Truman was starting to get lobbied really hard from both sides, kind of the extremes of both sides on this issue, and it was creating some annoyance for him. After a while, he kind of said, no more, I've got all the input I need, kind of leave me alone to figure this out. He refused to meet with Chaim Weizmann, who was a leading Zionist from Palestine who had come to the United States to try to lobby Truman in this area. In stepped Eddie Jacobson. Eddie Jacobson, as you recall from earlier episodes, one of the longest serving friends of Harry Truman, personal friends. They had been in the war together. They had the regimental canteen together. They had the haberdashery together. They had been friends for a long time. Jacobson, who was Jewish, had never talked politics with Harry Truman until now. He came to the White House, and Truman told him very clearly, I don't want to talk about Palestine, Eddie. You're welcome here in my White House anytime. I don't want to talk about Palestine. It became an emotional scene because Jacobson basically broke down. He urged the president, his friend, to meet with Chaim Weizmann. He had come all this way, and he made it personal. He looked over at a statuette in the Oval Office of Andrew Jackson and talked about Jackson being a hero of Truman. Well, he put it this way, that Weizmann was a hero of him. This was so important. Please meet with him. There were tears coming down his face, a very emotional meeting. Truman got silent for a bit. He thought about it, and he said, okay, I'm not happy with you, Eddie, but I will take the meeting. And he met with Weizmann in private March 18th of 1848, and Weizmann told him the choice for our people, Mr. President, is between statehood and extermination. History and Providence have placed this issue in your hands. I am confident you will yet decide in the spirit of moral law. Truman was moved. He told Weizmann at that meeting that he was inclined to support the plan for partition. And then the very next day, he had a shock from the morning newspapers. The U.S. representative at the United Nations, Warren Austin, announced that the Americans were not going to support partition. And again, this was kind of the view of the State Department. He announced it at the Security Council. Instead, the Americans were going to support trusteeship under the United Nations, which basically was punting the issue down the road. Now, Truman knew nothing about this announcement. He picked up the morning paper. The first thing he did was called Clifford, and he said to Clifford, can you come down right now? There's a story in the papers on Palestine. I don't understand what has happened. They talked about it a little bit, and Truman's thinking, this isn't my policy, and look, what did I just tell Weizmann? I'm going to support him. He said to Clifford that, isn't that hell? I am now in the position of a liar and a double-crosser. Well, it turned out the United Nations didn't have the votes anyway for trusteeship. Times were getting close. April the 9th, Truman confided to Jacobson that he definitely was leaning toward partition, and the United States would recognize the Jewish state if they declared their independence. But there was still one major obstacle, and maybe it was the biggest obstacle of all: the Secretary of State, George Marshall, whom Truman revered, he respected, trusted his opinion probably more than anybody else on the planet when it came to these kinds of things, and Marshall was adamantly against recognizing Israel if they declared independence. In fact, Marshall said boldly to the president, I said bluntly that if the president were to follow Mr. Clifford's advice, and if in the elections I were to vote, I would vote against the president. Nevertheless, Harry Truman was unmoved. It was the right thing to do. Partition was his policy. He made this clear. And so on May the 14th, 1948, midnight in Jerusalem, 6 o'clock in the evening in Washington, D.C., the mandate ended. The Jews declared their state of Israel. The name came out for the first time. And 11 minutes later, the United States became the first nation to recognize the independent state of Israel. By the way, the Soviet Union was right behind them. They were next. But the Americans were first, sending a very, very strong signal. Now, the Israelis cheered this. The Arabs decried it. The Arabs declared war. They fought for about 9 months. The Israelis won that war, and they actually got more territory in the process. The following year, the chief rabbi for Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, came to the United States and told Truman the following: God put you in your mother's womb so that you could be the instrument to bring about the rebirth of Israel after 2,000 years. For Harry Truman, it was another incredibly tough decision, but it was the nature of his presidency. It was the right thing to do, and he did it. That is Harry Truman, standing up for what's right, civil rights and Palestine, and in Israel, from the life of Harry Truman. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.